George was musical. In fact, all of these people were musical to some degree. George played instruments, violin and clavichord, and he sang. They all sang. Of course, Handel had been a great favorite at court for a generation. Others too. He was artistic. He painted, did credible painting. He read history omnivorously, and he was a cartographer. He was a man of education. He was not a dunce, as so many people want to make him out, not at all. But he was very determined and rather narrow-minded in some ways. His court was dowdy, and that's all we can say about it. As his sons, he had all his children, you see, and 7 of them were boys. So as the boys came along and were old enough, he put them to work in Kew Gardens, which was adjacent to the palace there. Had it all set out. It was a great walled, it's a park now, but it was all walled off and made into vegetable patches. And then he made the boys go out and work the patches, hoeing and weeding and doing whatever you do in the garden. And of course they hated it. Oh, they were so resentful. And people would crawl up on the wall, look at the princes sweating away in the sun and make fun, Oh, God, can you imagine? Yeah, they really resented their father for Farmer George. The public would call the king. Oh, yes. Well, he would get up at 5, light his own fire, make his own tea. His equerries and all came in finally and got him dressed, but he was up and around in early hours. His Majesty's government decided that the colonies should pay more toward the Crown's expenditures, or the government's expenditures. Now, the interesting thing about the colonies, there were now 13, there had been 14. Each colony had its own assembly, which it elected, voted into office and elected, and most of them had their own elected governors, and they were rich, and they taxed themselves. The tax money was spent in the colonies on the colonists, and some of it went back to the Crown. They were Crown colonies. The Crown made some money off that, always, but now they wanted to make more. The colonies produced wealth for the shareholders of the corporations who ran the colonies, or whose colonies they were. So that's the way that worked. And the thing is that in the 1760s, the Crown, under Grenville, Rockingham, and North, these were succeeding prime ministers, began to tax the colonists directly. I hope you see the significance of this. They went right over the local colonial assemblies and taxed the colonists directly. And this is what aggravated the colonists, nothing else. And this is what brought on the guerrilla war, which ruined the whole thing for England. Finally, because it was so unpopular, at first, the king was all for this. This was his government. And Parliament, well, both houses, at least the House of Commons, favored it. And the British public were not out of it until they realized they were going over the drink to fight Uncle Fred and Aunt Susie. So they weren't going to participate. And the British simply would not. There was no draft of Englishmen to go to the war, but they were press-ganged into the army. And they began to avoid it. Well, of course, they had to have troops. So the king went to his wife's relatives, the Duke of Hesse, and hired his army, which was fine. They were all for hire. So the Hessians came to fight the war. And interestingly enough, in 1776, the biggest land invasion ever mounted in this period of history was launched against the British colonies by Britain. Fleet after fleet, army after army sent in. And didn't they do well? And let that be a lesson to us. Well, of course, the whole thing turned very unpopular. The king had rocks thrown at him in public. Governments came and went, and the whole thing disintegrated. It was a huge disaster. Everybody was very disillusioned with it. And the king never gave up on the idea that the colonies had been out of line and that he'd done the right thing. But it all ended, and finally, in desperation, they recognized the independence of the United States in 1783. This is years after the fighting stopped. And it broke the king's heart.